The pediatric wing of Atlanta Memorial Hospital was unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon. Nurse Rose Chen had just finished her fourth cup of coffee, trying to stay alert after 10 hours into her shift. She'd been working in pediatric emergency care for 15 years, and something about today felt different. The calm before the storm, as her grandmother used to say. That's when the emergency alarm blared through the corridors. Code Blue, pediatric emergency. Code Blue. The voice over the intercom jolted Rose from her momentary rest. She sprinted down the hallway, her comfortable nursing shoes squeaking against the freshly polished floor. Her mind was already running through possible scenarios, but nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, was being rushed in. Her face was swollen, lips turning a scary shade of blue, and she was struggling to breathe. Rose's trained eyes quickly spotted the telltale signs of a severe allergic reaction. The girl's pink dress was stained with what looked like birthday cake, and a half-eaten peanut butter cookie was still clutched in her tiny hand. "What's her name?" Rose called out to the paramedics while quickly checking the girl's vital signs. "Annie," one of them responded, "Annie Thompson. Father's right behind us in his car." Rose didn't waste a second. She immediately called for epinephrine while starting her initial assessment. The girl's throat was closing up fast, and her oxygen levels were dropping dangerously low. Every second counted. Just then, heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. A tall man burst through the emergency room doors, his face red with panic and exertion. He was wearing worn-out jeans and a long-sleeved shirt despite the Georgia heat. But what caught Rose's attention weren't his clothes, it was the glimpse of controversial tattoos peeking out from under his sleeves and collar. The moment his eyes met hers, she saw it, that flash of disgust, that momentary hesitation, that look she'd seen too many times before. But right now, none of that mattered. A child's life was hanging by a thread. "Sir, I'm Nurse Chen. Your daughter is having a severe allergic reaction. Did she eat anything unusual today?" Rose kept her voice steady and professional, even as the father's face twisted with visible discomfort at taking directions from her. It was her cousin's birthday party," he stammered, clearly torn between his prejudice and his daughter's desperate situation. "There were cookies. I didn't know. I'd always check everything she eats." Rose nodded while efficiently inserting an IV line into Annie's small arm. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, tears rolling down her swollen cheeks. "You're doing great, sweetheart," Rose whispered, giving Annie's hand a gentle squeeze. "We're going to make you feel better real soon." The father, who introduced himself as Robert, stood awkwardly by the bedside, his large frame seeming out of place among the medical equipment. His hands kept clenching and unclenching, and he couldn't seem to decide whether to look at his daughter or the floor, anywhere but directly at Rose. As the emergency team worked around them, Rose noticed something start to change. With each careful movement she made, with each gentle word she spoke to Annie, Robert's rigid posture began to soften ever so slightly. When Annie's oxygen levels improved after the epinephrine shot and she managed to squeeze her father's hand, Rose saw tears welling up in his eyes. "She's responding well to the treatment," Rose explained, adjusting the oxygen flow. "But we'll need to keep her under observation for at least 24 hours. Anaphylactic shock can sometimes have a second wave." For the first time since he arrived, Robert looked directly at Rose. The hatred in his eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps even the tiniest hint of gratitude. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The next few hours would prove crucial, not just for Annie's recovery, but for something much bigger than any of them realized at that moment. As Rose settled in for what she knew would be a long night of monitoring her young patient, she had no idea that this emergency would become one of the most significant moments of her career, and not just because of the medical crisis she had helped resolve. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the beginning of an unexpected journey that would challenge deep-rooted prejudices and prove that sometimes the strongest medicine isn't found in any hospital cabinet, but in the simple acts of human kindness and professional dedication. Want me to continue with part 2 of the story? The night shift at Atlanta Memorial was just beginning, but for Nurse Rose, time had become a blur of vital sign checks and careful observations. Little Annie's condition remained delicate. Every few minutes, Rose would glance at the monitors, making sure the girl's breathing stayed stable. The soft beeping of medical equipment created a steady rhythm in the dimly lit room. Robert hadn't left his daughter's side. He sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his large frame making it look almost comically small. His sleeve had rolled up slightly, revealing more of his tattoos, symbols of hate that seemed to clash with the gentle way he stroked his daughter's hand. Rose noticed how he would quickly pull his sleeve down whenever other staff members entered the room. Around midnight, Annie's condition suddenly took a turn. Her breathing became labored again, and the monitors started beeping more rapidly. Rose rushed to her side, immediately recognizing the signs of a biphasic reaction, the dangerous second wave she had warned Robert about earlier. "What's happening?" Robert jumped up, panic clear in his voice. All his previous prejudices seemed forgotten in that moment of fear. She was getting better. Rose moved with calm efficiency, already calling for backup. "This sometimes happens with severe allergic reactions," she explained while checking Annie's vitals. "Her body is having a second response, but we're prepared for it." The next hour was intense. Rose worked alongside the emergency response team, her movements precise and determined. She noticed how Robert watched her hands, steady, gentle, yet confident as they administered medication and adjusted equipment. His face showed a complex mix of emotions: fear for his daughter, confusion about his own beliefs, and something that looked almost like reluctant admiration. During a particularly scary moment when Annie's oxygen levels dipped dangerously low, Rose heard Robert muttering under his breath. She caught fragments of what sounded like a prayer, mixed with quiet pleas. "Please God, she's all I got. Please." Rose felt her heart twist. In that moment, she didn't see the hate-filled symbols on his skin or the prejudice in his earlier glares. She saw a terrified father who loved his daughter more than anything in the world. Sometimes, she thought, love was the best medicine for hatred. As the crisis slowly came under control, Rose noticed Annie trying to say something through her oxygen mask. She leaned closer to hear the girl's whispered words. "Daddy." Annie's voice was barely audible. The nurse's hands are so soft, like Mommy's were. Robert's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. Rose pretended not to notice the tear that rolled down his cheek as he quickly wiped it away. She busied herself checking the IV line, giving him a moment to compose himself. Later, when things had calmed down again, Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. "My wife," he said, staring at the floor. "She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Annie doesn't usually let anyone touch her hands. Says they're not soft like her mama's were." Rose nodded, understanding the weight of what he was sharing. It wasn't just medical information, it was a piece of their story, offered like an olive branch in this sterile hospital room. As the night progressed, Rose noticed small changes in Robert's behavior. He stopped pulling his sleeves down when other staff members came in. When the Asian American respiratory therapist came to check on Annie, Robert actually made eye contact and thanked him. They were tiny steps, but in Rose's experience, big changes often started with the smallest of movements. Around 3 a.m., Annie finally fell into a peaceful sleep. The monitors showed stable vital signs, and her breathing had returned to normal. Rhodes was adjusting the blanket around the sleeping child when Robert spoke again. "I don't understand," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Everything I was taught, everything I believed." He trailed off, looking lost. Rose continued her work, giving him space to process his thoughts. Sometimes, she knew, the most powerful responses came from silence. The night shift was nearing its end, but Rose stayed past her hours, wanting to ensure Annie's stability. As the first rays of sunrise began to peek through the hospital windows, they cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating all three of them in the same light: nurse, father, and child, each part of a story that was far from over. The morning shift would be arriving soon, but something fundamental had shifted during those critical night hours. It wasn't just Annie's medical crisis that had been overcome, something else was beginning to heal, something deeper and more profound than any physical ailment. As Rose finally prepared to hand over to the day shift nurse, she caught Robert watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but the wall of hatred he'd walked in with had definitely cracked. Sometimes, she reflected, The most important healing happened not in the body, but in the heart. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across Annie's room. Even though her shift had ended hours ago, Nurse Rose couldn't bring herself to leave. She'd seen something change in Robert's eyes during the night. A tiny spark of doubt in his long-held beliefs, and she felt drawn to see where this might lead. Annie was doing much better now. Her color had returned to normal, and she was sitting up in bed, carefully coloring in a book one of the nurses had brought her. Robert dozed in the chair beside her, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. "Look," Annie whispered to Rose, holding up her drawing. "It's you, making me better." The crayon artwork showed a figure in blue scrubs with a big smile, surrounded by what looked like colorful hearts. Rose's own heart melted a little. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. You're quite the artist." Robert stared at their voices, blinking away his exhaustion. For a moment, he looked confused, as if trying to remember where he was. Then his eyes fell on Rose, and she saw that familiar internal struggle flash across his face. "Daddy, look what I drew for Nurse Rose." Annie's excited voice cut through the tension. She held up her artwork proudly. Robert looked at the drawing, then at his daughter's beaming face, and something seemed to crack in his carefully constructed world. It's really good, Princess," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Throughout the morning, Rose noticed how Robert watched her interactions with Annie. She showed the little girl how to use her new inhaler, explaining everything in simple terms that made Annie giggle. "Think of it like a superhero's special power spray," she'd said, making whooshing sounds that had Annie laughing out loud. Around lunchtime, an older black orderly named Bill came in to deliver Annie's meal. Rose saw Robert tense up, his old prejudices fighting with his new experiences. But when Bill made Annie laugh by pretending the Jello was doing a dance, Robert's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You know," Robert said later when Annie was napping, "I never thought." He stopped, struggling with his words. "I mean, the way you all treated her, treated us." Rose pulled up a chair, sensing he needed to talk. "We're all just people here," she said simply, "trying our best to help other people." "My father," Robert continued, staring at his hands, "he always said, well, you can probably guess what he said." I never questioned it. Never had a reason to, I guess. He looked up at Annie's peaceful sleeping face. "But seeing you with her, seeing how much you cared, it doesn't fit with everything I was taught to believe." Just then, Annie stirred in her sleep, whimpering slightly. Rose automatically reached out to adjust her blanket, her movements gentle and practiced. Robert watched, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. "My wife," he said suddenly, before we lost her, she used to tell me I needed to think for myself. Said I was teaching Annie the wrong things." His voice caught. "I got so angry at her for saying that. But maybe she was right." Rose listened quietly, letting him work through his thoughts. Sometimes, she knew, the most important part of healing was having someone willing to listen without judgment. As the afternoon wore on, more staff members came and went, nurses, doctors, technicians. Rose noticed how Robert's reactions changed with each interaction. The tension in his shoulders gradually eased. He started making eye contact, even managing small nods of acknowledgement. During one of Annie's tests, a young resident doctor came in, a woman wearing a hijab. Rose held her breath, expecting Robert's old prejudices to surface. But he surprised her by asking the doctor questions about Annie's condition, actually listening to the answers. "It's strange," he said later, when they were alone again. "All my life, I've been so sure about everything. Now, it's like I'm seeing things I never noticed before, or maybe I just didn't want to notice." Annie woke up then, asking for water. Rose watched as Robert helped her with the cup, his tattooed hands gentle as they guided the straw to her lips. The contrast was striking, symbols of hate performing acts of love. "You're a good father," Rose said quietly. "You clearly love her very much." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I want to be better," he whispered, more to himself than to Rose. "For her. I don't want her growing up thinking, feeling." He gestured helplessly at his tattoos. As the day drew to a close, Rose could sense that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't a complete transformation. Those took time and hard work. But it was a beginning, a crack in the foundation of hatred that let a little light shine through. Annie was scheduled to be discharged the next day. As Rose prepared to finally head home, she heard Annie's voice pipe up. "Will you be here tomorrow, Nurse Rose?" "I will," she promised, smiling at the little girl who had unknowingly helped bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable just days ago. Robert stood up, clearing his throat. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "Not just for saving her life, but for showing me something different." As Rose walked out of the hospital that evening, she thought about how change happens. Sometimes it's dramatic and sudden, like Annie's allergic reaction. But more often, it's quiet and gradual, like the slow melting of ice in spring. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was content knowing that something important had begun in that hospital room, something that went far beyond medical care. The next morning brought a different kind of tension to Annie's hospital room. It was discharge day, but something was clearly bothering Robert. He paced the small space, running his hands through his hair, stealing glances at Rose whenever she came to check on Annie. Annie had made friends with practically every staff member on the floor. The breakfast lady, a cheerful woman with beautiful dark skin and gray-streaked hair, brought her extra fruit with a wink. The janitor, a Hispanic man named Alberto, made her laugh by drawing smiley faces on the whiteboard while cleaning. Each interaction seemed to affect Robert deeply, like puzzle pieces forcing him to see a picture he'd spent years trying to ignore. "Nurse Rose." Annie called out excitedly when Rose came in for morning rounds. "Look what Miss Betty from the cafeteria gave me." She proudly held up a small stuffed bear wearing tiny scrubs. Rose smiled, checking Annie's vitals one last time. "That's adorable. What are you going to name it?" "Rose," Annie declared without hesitation. "Because it helps people feel better, just like you." Robert, who had been standing by the window, made a strange choking sound. When Rose looked over, she saw him quickly wiping his eyes. Later that morning, while Annie was getting her final checkup with the doctor, Robert finally spoke about what was troubling him. "I've got this meeting tonight," he said, his voice low and strained. "With my group." He rubbed his tattooed arms unconsciously. "I don't think I can go anymore." "But they're not the kind of people you just walk away from." Rose continued preparing Annie's discharge papers, giving him space to continue. "Last night, I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about everything. About Annie." He paused, struggling with his words. "When her mama died, I promised I'd give her the best life possible. But now I'm wondering if I've been doing the exact opposite." Just then, they heard laughter from the hallway. Annie was returning in a wheelchair, as per hospital policy, being pushed by Dr. Chen, an Asian American pediatrician. The little girl was telling him an elaborate story about her stuffed bear's first surgery. Robert watched them, his face a storm of emotions. "Look at her," he said softly. "She doesn't see what I was taught to see. She just sees people." His voice cracked. "Good people who helped her when she needed it." Rose handed him the discharge papers. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we need to change," she said quietly. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "Everything I've believed, everyone I've associated with, it's my whole life. But watching you all with Annie, seeing how you cared for her, for us, despite everything," he gestured to his tattoos. "I feel like I've been living in a dark room and someone just opened the curtains." Annie's voice interrupted their conversation. "Daddy, can Nurse Rose come visit us sometime? She can meet my cats." Robert looked at his daughter, then at Rose, and something seemed to settle in his expression. Maybe we could start by having lunch somewhere?" he asked hesitantly. "I mean, if you'd be willing to talk more. Help me understand how to do better." Before Rose could respond, a group of nurses came to say goodbye to Annie. Among them was one from physical therapy, Michelle from pediatric oncology, and Aisha from the night shift. Each had been part of Annie's care, each had shown kindness to both father and daughter, and each represented everything Robert's former beliefs had taught him to hate. As they surrounded Annie with hugs and well wishes, Robert stood back watching. Rose saw tears in his eyes again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. "They're my family here," Annie announced proudly to her father, hugging her new stuffed bear. "Yeah," Robert said softly, looking at each face in turn. "I'm starting to understand that we've got a lot to learn about family." As they prepared to leave, Robert hung back for a moment. "About that lunch," he said to Rose, "I know a quiet diner near here." I'd really like to hear more about everything. About how you learn to be so compassionate, even to people who don't deserve it." "Everyone deserves compassion," Rose replied. "That's actually the first thing they teach us in nursing school." The discharge process was finally complete. As they walked toward the elevator, Annie holding her father's hand and clutching her bear, several staff members waved goodbye. Robert nodded to each one, making eye contact, offering small smiles. Simple gestures that would have been unthinkable just days ago. In the elevator, Annie looked up at her father. "Daddy, why do you look sad?" "The doctors said I'm all better now." Robert knelt down to her level. "Sometimes, Princess, people can be sick in their hearts and minds, not just their bodies. But you know what? I think I'm starting to get better too." As Rose watched them leave the hospital, she thought about how healing comes in many forms. Sometimes it's as dramatic as saving a life, and sometimes it's as simple as showing kindness to someone who expects hatred. She had a feeling this wasn't the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. A week after Annie's discharge, Rose sat in the corner booth of a small diner just off Main Street. The coffee in front of her had gone cold, but she hardly noticed. She was too focused on listening to Robert, who had spent the last hour sharing his story. "I didn't go to that meeting," he said, staring into his own untouched coffee. "Couldn't do it, not after everything at the hospital. Called and told them I was done." His hands trembled slightly as he pushed up his sleeves, revealing the tattoos he'd once displayed proudly but now seemed to carry like a burden. "How did they take it?" Rose asked quietly, knowing such groups didn't typically accept departures well. Robert's laugh was hollow. "About as well as you'd expect. Got some threatening messages. Had to change my phone number." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But you know what's crazy? For the first time in years, I feel free." The waitress, a young woman with vitiligo, came to refill their cups. Robert looked her in the eyes and said, "Thank you," a small gesture that would have been impossible just days ago. Rose noticed how the waitress's surprised smile lit up her whole face. "Annie asked me something this morning," Robert continued after the waitress left. "She wanted to know why the men in my old group were so angry all the time. Said she didn't understand why they didn't like her nurse Rose and her new hospital friends." His voice cracked. "I couldn't give her an answer that made any sense. Because there isn't one." The diner's lunch crowd was starting to filter in. Rose watched as Robert observed the diverse mix of people. Businesswomen in suits, construction workers on their break, families with young children. His expression was different now, more open, questioning rather than judging. "You know what really got to me," he said suddenly. "When Annie was having that second reaction and I thought I might lose her like I lost her mother. In that moment, I didn't care about anyone's skin color or background. All I cared about was that there were skilled, caring people fighting to save my little girl." He rolled up his sleeves further, revealing more of the hatred inked into his skin. "I've been looking into tattoo removal," he said quietly. "Found a clinic that helps people like me, people who want to change. They do it for free, help you cover up the hate with something better." Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Annie's babysitter, sending a photo of Annie proudly showing off a drawing she'd made at school. It showed a diverse group of people holding hands around what appeared to be a hospital. Robert's eyes welled up as he showed Rose the picture. "She's got a school project about community helpers," he explained. "She insisted on drawing everyone who helped her at the hospital. Look at all the different colors she used for their skin." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Kids see the world so clearly, don't they? Before people like me teach them to hate." The lunch hour rush was in full swing now. Through the window, they could see people of all backgrounds going about their lives, talking, laughing, helping each other with doors and packages, sharing simple moments of human connection. "I've been doing a lot of reading," Robert said, pulling out a worn library card. "Books about civil rights, about different cultures. Things I should have learned long ago." The librarian, this wonderful older black woman, she's been helping me find good books to read with Annie too. Stories about different kinds of families, different traditions. Rose noticed how he sat straighter now, as if a heavy weight was lifting from his shoulders. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Sometimes I catch myself thinking the old ways, and I have to stop and correct myself. But then I think about Annie in that hospital bed and how everyone came together to help her, and it gets a little easier." He pulled out his wallet and showed Rose a new photo of Annie, taken at the park. She was playing with a diverse group of children, all of them covered in ice cream and wearing huge smiles. "This was last weekend," he said proudly. "First playdate I've ever let her have. Those kids' parents, they knew about my past, my tattoos, but they gave me a chance, just like you did." The diner was getting louder, filled with the buzz of conversation and clinking plates. But in their corner booth, a deeper kind of noise was being confronted, the sound of old beliefs crumbling, of a heart opening, of a mind embracing new truths. Yesterday, Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I threw away all my old literature, all the hate propaganda I'd collected over the years. Felt like cleaning out an infection." He looked up at Rose, his eyes clear and determined. "I want to do more though, not just change myself, but maybe help others change too, show them what I've learned." As Rose listened to Robert talk about his plans for the future, counseling, support groups, community service, she thought about how change ripples outward. One small act of kindness in a hospital room had started something that might touch countless lives. The waitress came back with their check, and Robert insisted on paying. As he walked to the counter, Rose saw him stop to help an elderly Chinese man who had dropped his cane. The simple act of human kindness brought tears to her eyes. The summer heat in Atlanta was intense, but inside the small tattoo removal clinic, Robert barely noticed the broken air conditioning. He was focused on the gentle humming of the laser machine as it worked to erase another symbol of his past. The process was painful, but he welcomed each sting as a step toward redemption. "You're doing great," said the technician, a kind-faced woman with warm brown skin. "Just a few more sessions, and this section will be completely gone." She had been working with Robert for 3 months now, watching his transformation both outside and in. Annie sat in the corner, coloring in her favorite activity book, the one about different cultures around the world that her new school counselor had given her. She looked up occasionally to give her father encouraging smiles. "Daddy," she called out, "look, I learned how to write peace in 3 different languages." She held up her book proudly, showing off the carefully copied characters. Robert smiled through the pain of the laser treatment. 6 months had passed since that life-changing hospital stay, and every day brought new changes. The threatening messages from his old associates had eventually stopped. Now his phone was filled with different numbers, his counselor, his support group members, the parents of Annie's new friends. After the session, they headed to the community center where Robert now spent his Wednesday evenings. He had joined a support group for people leaving hate groups, and recently they'd asked him to help lead some sessions. His story of how a black nurse's kindness had changed his life resonated with others struggling to break free from their own prejudices. "Remember when you first came here?" the group coordinator asked as they set up chairs for the evening meeting. "You could barely look anyone in the eye. Now look at you, helping others find their way out." Robert nodded, remembering those first difficult meetings. He'd sat in the back, shoulders hunched, still wearing long sleeves despite the heat. Now he wore short sleeves, his fading tattoos a visual testimony to his journey. Annie had her own activities at the center, art classes with kids from all kinds of backgrounds. Through the doorway, Robert could hear her laughing with her new friends. The sound always reminded him how close he'd come to teaching her the same hate that had poisoned his own life. "Today we're going to talk about fear," Robert began when the group assembled. "Because that's what hatred really is, fear dressed up as strength." He rolled up his sleeves, showing the fading marks of his past. 6 months ago, I was terrified of change. Terrified of admitting I was wrong. But then something happened that forced me to see the truth. He told them about the hospital, about Rose and the other healthcare workers who had saved his daughter despite his obvious prejudice. As he spoke, he noticed a younger man in the back wiping away tears. After the meeting, that same young man approached Robert. "My wife's pregnant," he whispered. "I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be. When you talked about your daughter..." Robert put a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "The greatest gift we can give our children is freedom from hate," he said. "I learned that lesson late, but not too late." On their way home, Annie chatted excitedly about her art class. "We're doing a project about heroes," she explained. "I'm drawing Nurse Rose and all the hospital people who helped me. Teacher says sometimes heroes don't wear capes, they wear scrubs." At a red light, Robert looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. She was growing so fast, her mind and heart open to all the beauty and diversity of the world. He thought about how close he'd come to closing her off from all that, to passing on the poison of prejudice. The next day was Robert's counseling session. His therapist, a wise older man who had helped many others leave hate groups, noticed the progress immediately. "Your energy is different today," he observed. "More peaceful." Robert nodded. "I visited the hospital yesterday," he said. "Just walked through the lobby, watched all the different people there. Used to be, all I could see were the differences. Now I see the connections." They talked about his progress, about the challenges still ahead. The counselor reminded him that transformation wasn't just about unlearning hate, it was about learning to love, to accept, to grow. That evening, Robert sat with Annie on their small apartment balcony. She was teaching him the words for peace that she'd learned, patiently correcting his pronunciation. As they practiced together, a family moved into the apartment across the way. A mixed-race couple with twin boys about Annie's age. Without hesitation, Annie waved to the twins. They waved back, shy but friendly. Robert watched this simple exchange with a full heart, remembering how, just months ago, he would have reacted differently to these new neighbors. "Can they come over to play sometime?" Annie asked hopefully. "Of course they can, Princess," Robert replied, meaning it completely. "We'll take them some welcome cookies tomorrow." As the sun set over Atlanta, Robert thought about how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. The journey wasn't easy. There were still moments of ingrained prejudice he had to consciously fight, still occasional nightmares about his past life. But with each step forward, with each new connection made, with each fading tattoo, he felt more like the father Annie deserved. A year had passed since that life-changing night in the hospital. The Atlanta Memorial Hospital auditorium was packed for their annual community health fair, but Robert hardly noticed the crowd. His hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces before him. In the front row, Annie sat proudly next to Nurse Rose, clutching her ever-present stuffed bear in medical scrubs. The bear's fur was a bit worn now, loved by countless hugs and adventures, but its tiny stethoscope still hung perfectly around its neck. "A year ago," Robert began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I walked into this hospital as one kind of person and walked out as another." He rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms now covered in new tattoos, beautiful artwork of healing symbols that covered the last traces of his hateful past. The audience listened intently as he shared his story. He told them about the fear and hatred he carried for so long, about how a medical emergency had forced him to confront his prejudices. He spoke about the kindness shown to him and his daughter by people he'd been taught to hate. "The hardest part wasn't changing my beliefs," he admitted. "It was facing the fact that I'd been wrong for so long, that I'd wasted so many years spreading hate when I could have been spreading love." In the audience, healthcare workers who had been there that night nodded in recognition. The breakfast lady who had given Annie extra fruit wiped away tears. Alberto, the janitor who drew smiley faces, smiled encouragingly. Robert continued, "My daughter recently asked me what courage means. I used to think courage was about being tough, about not letting anyone change your mind." He paused, looking at Annie. "But real courage, I've learned, is being willing to change. It's admitting when you're wrong. It's opening your heart even when you're scared." He told them about his journey over the past year. The support groups he now helped lead, the speaking engagements at schools where he warned young people about the dangers of hate groups, the community service work he'd started doing with families from all backgrounds. "The most amazing thing," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is how many people were willing to give me a second chance. People who had every right to turn their backs on me instead offered their hands in friendship." In the middle of his speech, Annie stood up suddenly and ran to the stage, unable to contain herself any longer. The audience laughed warmly as she hugged her father's legs. Robert picked her up and she whispered something in his ear that made him smile. "My daughter just reminded me to tell you about her school project," he said, still holding her. "She won first place for her essay about community heroes. She wrote about everyone in this hospital, how people of all backgrounds came together to help a little girl and change her father's heart." The room erupted in applause. In the back, Robert could see members of his support group who had come to watch him speak. Some of them were crying, perhaps seeing their own possible transformation in his story. After the speech, there was a small reception. Annie proudly showed off her school essay to anyone who would listen, while Robert spoke with audience members who wanted to share their own stories or ask how they could help others leave hate groups. Rose watched it all from a quiet corner, amazed at how far they'd come. The angry, prejudiced man who had walked into her emergency room a year ago was gone, replaced by someone who worked tirelessly to spread understanding and healing. "You know," Robert said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee, "Annie asked me something interesting this morning. She wanted to know if angels could be nurses." Rose laughed. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes angels wear scrubs and comfortable shoes," he replied with a smile. "And sometimes they're brave enough to show kindness to people who don't deserve it." As the evening wound down, Annie fell asleep in her chair, clutching her bear. Robert gathered her up gently, but before leaving, he turned to address the remaining hospital staff one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping me save not just my daughter's life, but my own soul." Outside, the Atlanta night was warm and peaceful. Stars twinkled above the hospital where a year ago, a life-threatening emergency had led to life-changing healing. As Robert carried his sleeping daughter to the car, he thought about how far they'd come, and how every day brought new opportunities to choose love over hate, understanding over fear, healing over hurt. Rose watched them drive away, thinking about how sometimes the biggest miracles in a hospital weren't the medical ones. Sometimes they were the quiet transformations that happened in human hearts, one kind act at a time. The story could have ended there, but in many ways it was just beginning. Because healing, like hate, ripples outward. And somewhere in Atlanta, a former white supremacist was teaching his daughter, and anyone else who would listen, that love was always stronger than hate, that it was never too late to change, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was open your heart to those you've been taught to fear. The end.